Today, we're diving into a story that has unfolded over decades. A story of how the unique, pluralistic culture of Kashmir was deliberately and systematically overshadowed. We're going to unpack the source material that documents this really profound and often painful transformation. It all really kicked off with this chilling ultimatum. Back in 1990, the source we're examining shows how these exact words, convert, leave, or die, were blasted from mosque loudspeakers aimed squarely at the region's Pandit minority. Now, you have to understand, this wasn't just a threat, it was a declaration, a sign that a new, terrifyingly intolerant order had arrived.
Okay, so how did we even get here? How did things reach this kind of breaking point? Well, the analysis takes us back to the late 1980s, and it traces the systematic dismantling of Kashmir's traditionally secular and, deeply intertwined culture. And this is where things get really interesting, because the analysis points to this major pivot. This wasn't just another political struggle anymore. The armed insurgency was basically repurposed, weaponized, to tear down Kashmir's moderate Sufi traditions and replace them with a rigid, imported ideology. The end goal? To purify the culture and reframe the entire conflict in purely theological terms.
This whole project began with very tangible targets. First, in August 1989, you had groups like the Allah Tigers going after public life, demanding that all cinemas and bars shut down. Then, just a few months later, the JKLF began assassinating key minority leaders. By January 1st, 1990, the entire public cultural landscape had effectively been silenced. And this really shows you their methods in action. These weren't just idle threats. Real violence, like the grenade attack on the Regal Cinema, was used to enforce these new rules. This image, a ruined theater marquee, it's not just a ruined theater. It became a powerful symbol of an entire way of life being snuffed out by force. All right, so once they had control of the public spaces, the project turned inward, and it began to focus on the private sphere. And right here, women became the primary battlefield for this new ideological war. What the analysis reveals here is a really calculated strategy. It argues that by controlling women's bodies, their behavior, everything about them, militant groups could signal the so-called purity of their movement. The insurgency was essentially rebranded as a social reform project, but its real aim was to completely dismantle female agency. And the campaign to do this was just systematic. Groups like Noorani Millet and Lashkar-e-Jabbar issued this wave of strict decrees. We're talking mandatory burqas, bans on everything from cell phones to beauty salons, threats against co-ed schools, even demanding that women quit their jobs. The goal was pretty simple: total erasure from public life. But, and this is the really cynical twist that the source points out, while all their rights were being systematically stripped away, women were also being instrumentalized. They were being recruited and trained for violence, some even as suicide bombers. It just shows this incredibly transactional view of gender. Women were to be controlled, but also, when needed, used. Okay, so this war on women, it was actually part of a much bigger objective: the total and complete destruction of the very soul of Kashmiri culture. Now, to really get what was lost, you have to understand this idea of Kashmiriyat. It's this beautiful, centuries-old mix of Hindu, Muslim, and Sufi traditions all woven together. But for the Wahhabi-inspired militants, this pluralism, it wasn't a strength. The analysis suggests they saw it as an existential threat to their monolithic black-and-white vision of the world. So what do you do if you want to destroy an idea? You attack its physical symbols. And the burning of the Shari Sharif shrine in 1995, that was a devastating blow. This wasn't just any building. It was a sacred site for both Muslims and Pandits, the literal embodiment of Kashmiriyat. Destroying it was like an attack on shared memory itself. So once those cultural bridges were burned, the next step, according to this analysis, was to remake the population itself. And this led to the most painful chapter in this whole story, the engineered exodus of the Kashmiri Pandit minority. And this campaign, wow, it was swift and it was brutal. We're back to those slogans blasting from loudspeakers, the threatening posters that just appeared overnight. The goal was explicit: terrorize the Pandit community into fleeing. And by doing so, cleanse the valley of any competing cultural or religious story. The result of this campaign is just staggering. An estimated 95% of the Kashmiri Pandit population,
We're talking somewhere between 100,000 and 350,000 people was forced to flee their ancestral homes.
And to make sure this demographic shift was permanent, to make sure there was no going back, the terror didn't stop. A series of horrific massacres followed. At Gul, at Wandama, at Medimarg, where those who dared to remain were systematically hunted down and killed. These acts were designed to extinguish any last flicker of hope of ever returning. Okay, so all of this begs a really important question. Was this whole movement homegrown? Well, the analysis we're exploring argues no, not at all. And it points to some powerful external forces that were fueling and sustaining this entire radicalization project. Now, according to the analysis we're digging into, this whole transformation was heavily propped up by a transnational network. The conflict was strategically shifted, you see, from a local dispute to becoming just another front in a global extremist cause. And this was driven by two key external catalysts. Okay, so let's break this down. On one side, you've got the ideological export. The document talks about Saudi Wahhabi funding, which pushed a rigid, puritanical version of Islam that was a direct assault on the local Sufi traditions. And on the other side, you've got state-sponsored terror, with Pakistan's policy institutionalizing violence through proxy groups, like the Resistance Front, or TRF. You could say one provided the blueprint, and the other provided the muscle. But, and this is important, even in the deepest, darkest of shadows, you find incredible acts of defiance. The final section of this analysis turns to the resilience of the Kashmiri people and what might be a potential path forward. And this is just so important to remember. The analysis makes it crystal clear that this was a forced social order, not some popular movement. For example, Kashmiri women famously defied the 2001 burqa deadline en masse. When acid attacks started happening, local communities actually formed their own patrols to protect women. This was real resistance from the ground up. So, where do things stand now? Well, in the post-2019 landscape, the document notes a real shift. Organized militancy and the unchecked power of those moral policing groups has declined, and that's opened up a window of opportunity. The threat from these new hybrid terror groups, though, it's still there. The path forward, the analysis argues, has to be a reclamation of that indigenous identity, of Kashmiriyat. And that really brings us to the core conclusion of this whole analysis. Lasting peace can only be secured through a kind of cultural revival, one that finally purges these imported ideologies and restores the pluralistic heart of the valley, with the agency of Kashmiri women right at its very center. Which leaves us with one last vital question. After more than 30 years of a deliberately engineered shadow, can a culture's indigenous light, its very soul, truly be reclaimed? That's the challenge, and the hope, that lies at the heart of this entire story.